Okay, so we are going to be talking about backyard habitat near water. For the purposes of this webinar, we're going to be talking mostly about creating habitat in water bodies. So I won't be talking too much about things like bird baths and other ways that you can add water to your landlocked yard. But a lot of these wetland plants, if you have native species in your yard, even if they're not on a waterfront and aren't wetland species, those native species will still create benefit for wildlife, and then you can just add some water to your yard. But for the purposes of this webinar, we're going to be talking about water and natural and man-made shorelines. So we're going to talk a little bit about what animals need water in their area, some different things to consider if you're thinking about adding habitat, what that habitat might look like, and why wetland plants are great for our environment in general. So who needs water? So we have all kinds of wildlife in the state of Florida. We have some very diverse wildlife here, and a lot of them require water for more than just drinking water. So every species on the planet requires water. It's something you learn very young, but we've got some species here that are very dependent on it. So amphibians, for instance, they require water, a body of water, to be very near to them because a lot of them depend on that moisture for breathing or breeding or laying their eggs in or near water. So they have a unique relationship with water as an amphibian species. But we need to keep in mind that wildlife habitat can be above, below, or in the water. So for those amphibian species, after they lay their eggs in the water, their young will drop down into the water and act like fish for a while. And so that vertical structure of plants is very important to those species. Other species, like wading birds, will hunt and forage in and around water. They may not depend on the water specifically, but their prey does. And so having that natural habitat with native species can help amphibians and birds, reptiles, all sorts of mammals, and other critters as well. So like Lara mentioned in our last webinar about tips for success for backyard habitat, you just want to keep in mind that wildlife requires 4 things for it to be considered habitat. There needs to be food, water, shelter, and space for the population of that wildlife. So what we're going to be talking about for the most part here is food and shelter. So the water, since we're talking about it near water, is a given. So just keep that in mind. So we're going to have our first poll question here, and Lara's going to take care of that for me. So the question is, true or false, residents can create habitat for specific wildlife, like birds, without attracting other wildlife, like amphibians or reptiles. True or false? I'll give you just a couple more minutes, or a couple more seconds to see if we can get more people to participate. All right, excellent. Lara, you can go ahead and close that for me. So we actually have a pretty good split here of true and false, but I would say that the answer to this question, can a resident create habitat for a specific type of wildlife without attracting other wildlife, is false, at least in most natural areas in Florida. You can create specific habitat for specific wildlife, absolutely. But generally speaking, in the state of Florida and most places on the planet, if you create attractive habitat, it will attract many different kinds of animals, insects, and prey items, which is important because that's part of what habitat is. It provides those food sources for wildlife that you're interested in. So when you're planning your wildlife habitat, it should be goal-oriented. So think about what species you have in your backyard or on your waterfront already. Think about the population of them. Do you have a lot of them? Would you like to attract more of a particular type of species? And that will give you some direction as to what plants you might be interested in adding to your location. Some of those plants might be specifically for breeding, for food, for shelter, and so by knowing what species you're trying to attract, you can really give yourself a good head start. It's important to note that our ecosystems and food webs are extremely complex. There are a lot of layers that go on. So prey items for say a largemouth bass in Florida, are smaller fish. And what do those smaller fish eat? The smaller fish eat even smaller fish, or microorganisms and plant life. So to have a fully functioning system, what you need to do is identify what part of your waterfront is lacking for that animal's habitat. Oftentimes, it's habitat for prey items. So when you're planting a lot of aquatic plants, or even if you just want a small section of aquatic plants, sometimes in Florida you're going to need to use some trial and error. This whole idea of getting residents to plant aquatic vegetation on and near their shoreline is something that professionals and educators have been trying to work on for a long time now, but good documentation on survival rates and planting densities just aren't there yet, in my opinion. So we have a lot of recommendations from the University of Florida IFAS Extension and from Florida Fish and Wildlife, but when it comes to your particular yard or your particular shoreline, you'll just want to try some things out. You know, pickerel weed might be great for one person's shoreline and might not work at all in another person's shoreline. It could have to do with depth, pH, what wildlife species are already there, and so just be patient and keep trying, and there are lots of things you can use. So wildlife are going to be more common in some areas than in others, and what I mean by that is you might have a lot of roseate spoonbills in one section of the county, and you might have absolutely none in the other section, and that's because of the habitat that's available to them and where they are used to being in. And so if you try to attract one species, say you've got roseate spoonbills on the other side of town, but you don't have any on your particular lake and you're interested in attracting them, if you plant the species that they might be more interested in because their prey might be there, you might also attract other beautiful species as well. So just keep that in mind. That was the point of that poll question we've had there. So some of the wildlife you might not intend to attract might be things you're not super thrilled about, like snakes or frogs or things like that. But you will also attract other wonderful species that you really want to see as well. So be open-minded, but be prepared. Have a plan and be patient. So we're going to have another poll question right here. And this question is, if I own property on a public waterway and would like to create wildlife habitat, I need a permit from Florida Fish and Wildlife to do which of the following? Oh, lots of blank stares. Well, I imagine that's what you're doing to your computer. It's okay, there's no penalty for wrong answers. Just go ahead and guess a couple if you're not sure. And Lara, when we're done with this one, after you broadcast the results, can we leave it up for a second? Thank you.
Yeah, sorry about that.
No, it's fine. All right, just another second. Excellent. Okay, Larry, you can go ahead and close it. Okay, so we're going to talk about these one by one for a second. So if you want to plant aquatic plants on your shoreline or in the water just off your shoreline, you likely do not need a permit. Now, I say likely because some of our wildlife biologists in their particular area, or their aquatic plant biologists, some of them like to know, but you do not technically need a permit to plant aquatic plants on your shoreline, assuming you own the shoreline. If you want to remove a few plants from your shoreline by hand, you do not need a permit for that. You have to keep it to less than 50% of your shoreline or less than 50 feet, whichever is less. If you want to remove any plants with herbicide, you do need a permit. You cannot use herbicide on a public waterway without a permit from Florida Fish and Wildlife. The same goes for invasive species. So invasive species are encouraged, it's encouraged that you get rid of them, but because it is removing plant life from the shoreline, you do need a permit to do it. The nice thing about the FWC permit for removing aquatic species is it allows you to remove more than 50 feet or more than 50% of your shoreline if they are invasive species and if you plan to replant them with native species. So the ones on this question that you need a permit from Florida Fish and Wildlife are C and D, which I apologize they didn't actually say that, but it's the last two. So most of you, well, 44% of you got that right. So thank you so much. All right. So we're going to talk for a second about creating habitat for fish. This is the only section I'm going to spend specifically on one type of wildlife. But fish are interesting because we can't typically see what they're doing, especially in waterways in Florida. So fish need a variety of vertical structure, and what I mean by that are different types of aquatic plants provide different types of habitat. This is just like what you would expect on land, it's just underwater. So the big circle here that you can see, that's got a plant called eelgrass in it. And eelgrass is very similar to turtle grass in the marine system or seagrass in the marine system. It's actually very closely related, but it's a freshwater species. And those blades can get up to 4 feet in length and provide wonderful habitat for a myriad of species. They can also easily be pulled out of the lake bottom sediments. So some of our fish that create beds to lay their eggs in can move those species out of their way. They need a variety in water depth. And one of the reasons for this is that depth helps the fish self-regulate temperature. So if you've got a really shallow waterway, you are also likely going to have really warm water in Florida. So by having some deep pockets, if you talk to any fishermen around, you'll know in freshwater lakes, those deep pockets are where a lot of the fish are hanging out. It's because in summer it gets super hot here. So that deep water is colder, it helps the fish regulate temperature, but it also has higher dissolved oxygen. And so if we get a fish kill event because of high temperatures after a stormy week, those deep pockets can help fish survive that unfortunate series of events. It also is important that there are habitat for their prey species. So in some lakes and ponds, if we have a disproportionate amount of sport fish or large predator fish and not enough aquatic plant cover, there won't be a lot of prey species, and your larger, older fish may have some trouble finding food because there won't be a lot of it because they already ate it. So on that note, fish feeders are not usually necessary, but they can help you bring some fish closer to shore or closer to a dock if you're interested in catching bluegill or catfish. And if you've got grass carp in your lake or pond and they're eating up all the vegetation because they already ate all the hydrilla, fish feeders can be helpful because grass carp will sometimes prefer fish food to natural aquatic vegetation. So if you're starting to see an overactive grass carp because there's just not enough food in the water body for them, some fish feeders can be helpful in that regard. But that would work best in small systems. So what you can do to help your aquatic habitat for fish really depends on who owns the water. So a lot of our stormwater ponds are being managed as lakes. You'll see this a lot in homeowners associations or apartment complexes and large subdivisions. And those systems are managed by the local water management district and in some cases Florida Department of Environmental Protection. And for stormwater ponds, they're managed for flood protection. And so being allowed to dig out pockets to increase your fish habitat might be something that's simply not allowed unless they're doing an overall stormwater pond renovation project. And so if you know that your stormwater pond is about to be renovated or dredged out, you might be able to talk to the agency that manages your pond and see if you can't make it a little better for fish habitat. But I will warn you, that is an uphill battle because they have so many they need to take care of that it's difficult for them to prioritize that sort of thing. Now, if you own your own private pond, say it's a catfish pond on your large piece of property, as long as it's not connected to any other public waterway via creek, canal, drainage ditch, anything like that, if the pond is entirely on your property, is not managed by an agency for flood protection, you can pretty much do a lot of your own choices there. So you can add fish stock. If you are hoping to increase your bass population, you might want to add some prey species like bluegill to it. You can add your own catfish, and you can do this by getting in contact with Florida Fish and Wildlife. They do have a list of hatcheries that you can purchase from, and there are some regulations. You are not allowed to use certain types of bass in Florida. But as long as you're using a native species and purchasing it from a hatchery or fishery that is licensed, you can add fish stock to your private pond. You can also add those deeper areas when you're designing a new pond, or if you've got an existing fish pond, you can always add those deeper pockets too. So these, I just wanted to pop these up here real quick. If you live in the state of Florida, remember that water is owned by Floridians, and so you have a lot more freedom to do what you like with your fish pond if it's entirely on your property. If you have a question about a local lake and want to know if it's part of FWC's stock fish program, because they do stock public lakes with fish occasionally, they have a list of those lakes, and you can get a hold of them by going to the Florida Fish and Wildlife website, which is myfwc.com, or you can call your regional office. So these are your regions here. If you're in Lara or my counties of Polk and Pinellas, your region is the Southwest FWC region, and their office is in Lakeland. They do have several other remote offices for different programs, like the Aquatic Plant program is based out of Homeland. But if you give that main number a call, they will be able to connect you with whoever you need to talk to about fish ponds and the stocking program, as well as if you have any questions about whether or not your property connects to public waterways and who owns your shoreline. So good information to have there. So now we're going to switch gears a little bit and talk about native wetland species for wildlife habitat. So we have another poll question. Creating wildlife habitat near water may create which of the following additional benefits? And you can check all that apply here. All right, well, that's probably pretty close to everyone. I just realized on this question, it's difficult to know how many people have participated. But as you can see by everyone's votes, all four of those are benefits that are added by creating additional wildlife habitat. And the reason that is because when we're talking about wildlife habitat near water, we're almost always talking about aquatic plants. There are other things you can do, like putting in nest boxes for aquatic bird species like wood ducks, but generally speaking, we're going to be talking about plants. And so all of these things are benefits of additional wildlife habitat. So wetland plants offer habitat elements for all of these different types of species. And so when we're talking about wildlife habitat, remember, like I've said a few times today, you want to think about habitat for the prey, habitat for the species you're interested in, and then making sure that they have a food source as a part of that as well. Our native wildlife are more adapted to native plants than they are to exotic plants. And so by having a healthy native aquatic plant community and added resilience to invasive plants, what you're doing is you're providing a food source that can work within itself to exclude other species like those invasive exotic plants. Invasive exotic aquatic plants tend to be generalists. They're really good at moving into areas and taking over, but they need that opening to exist in a lot of ecosystems. So if we're able to maintain healthy aquatic plant communities, our aquatic systems will be more resilient to that type of invasion. And we have another question. All right, so it is better to plant, I think I just gave you the answer to this. Is it better to plant native vegetation over non-native vegetation because of why? All right, that's pretty good, Lara. Thank you. So the answer is all of the above. Native plants are more resilient against natural pests and diseases, about temperature and other things of that nature. If they are planted well, if you're putting them in your yard and you don't overplant them, native plants will also require less care and less resources. You won't need to fertilize them or irrigate them nearly as much, if at all, and aquatic plants never. And then native plants are better adapted to our soil conditions as well, so that you don't need to adjust for soil pH and other things like that. Okay, so why aquatic plants? And I'm going to try and speed up just a little bit because I'd like to leave plenty of time for questions. But we discussed most of these already. So you help buffer against pollution and human impact on your local waterways. So residents who are super concerned about water quality in their lakes, rivers, streams, things of that nature should be really good friends of wetland plants, especially in the state of Florida. And so they also provide that dissolved oxygen, which that sentence got cut off, but which can help make the waterway more resilient to algae blooms and fish kills. Additionally, native species tend to have natural checks and balances. In Florida, that tends to be water depth. So some species that are known as weedy species like cattails and Sporedock, if there are deeper areas, if the waterway has those deeper areas, those plants will stop growing out into those deep areas. So we have a lot of shallow stormwater ponds, which is why you see a lot of cattails, because they can grow pretty much into 6 feet of water. And so when you've got stormwater ponds that are less than 6 feet, it's no wonder that they can take over. And the last poll question, I promise. Which of the following plants is an emergent plant? And don't worry if you feel a little blindsided, we have not really talked about the first 2 plants yet. All right, it looks like that's all the answers we're going to get, Lara. Thank you. The majority of you were correct. It is pickerel weed, and we will be looking at some pickerel weed in just a second. So as we discussed before, our native species have checks and balances that keep them in control. And so if you look at this this graphic here, the emergent plants are rooted in the mud and emerge out into the air above the water. These are also most typically your shoreline species because they will move up above the water line if the water is a stable water level, and if it's an area where the water levels change throughout the seasons, they like to keep their feet wet, but they can be slightly more out of the water than the other species. So we've also got floating leaved rooted plants, which are rooted in the mud, but do not stand up out of the water on their own most of the time. There are a couple exceptions, but these are your water lilies and things of that nature. Your submersed plants are your eel grasses. For the most part, we've got a lot of different native aquatic species that are submersed plants, and most people don't know them because in an ideal world, they do not come up above the water level, and they do not clog up your boat engine if you drive through them. But in shallow systems or towards the end of the summer when they've had all season to grow as high and as tall as they can become nuisance species, even though they are natives, but they provide a lot of fish habitat. And then we've got free-floating plants as well, which, as you can see, the roots just hang down into the water column. So with these wetland species, their growth habit is what will give you the best idea of where they will be successful. So on your shoreline, you need to measure the water depth and know your average over the whole year and your seasonal averages and extremes. So if you have an area where the water table or the lake level or canal level will fluctuate by 3 feet vertically, you need to be very careful about where you plant your aquatic plants because they need to stay wet most of the year. And so you might limit yourself on where you put them in order to have the best success and the best species that can survive. This is where that trial and error really comes in. It can be difficult to monitor exactly where the water is all the time, especially as the water drops. It might be a higher water table up into the shoreline, and so just try and guess the best you can, do some measurements, and try a couple species. Since you don't want to overplant, feel free to see what lives. Plant a couple of different species where you want to have them, but plant them in clumps, so keep species together. And the reason for that is we found that people prefer the look of that, and if they prefer the look of it, you're less likely to get complaints from your neighbors, which makes everyone happy. Additionally, know what species you're planting and choose the right wetland plant for the right shoreline. So an example of this is Sporedock or alligator flag. If you have a very shallow lake or very shallow waterfront and it's a small pond, I do not recommend planting either one of those species. Sporedock can really take over in a small pond that doesn't have water movement or isn't deep enough to keep it out. And it can get quite weedy. It is a native, it provides a lot of benefits, but if the entire shoreline of residents is very unhappy about that plant, what we're doing is we're creating negative attitudes towards our aquatic plants, and we want to avoid that at all costs. Alligator flag is another one that looks really pretty from afar, but it can get 6 to 8 feet tall on a shoreline. So if you're really enthusiastic about seeing the water, I don't recommend planting that one on small shorelines. It's a great clumping plant if you have a lot of lake frontage, but just know the plant that you're thinking about planting. The idea here is you can take the image on the left, which is turf grass down to the water, and turn it into one of the images on the right. These were images that tested well with focus group participants in Gainesville for a Florida-Friendly Landscaping focus group project by Gail Hansen, and they described these images on the right as being park-like or manicured but still natural. And what they found out through those focus groups was it was the large swaths of the same type of plant in clumps that people really liked. It provides great habitat whether it's in clumps or not, but if people like it, they're more likely to maintain it, and it might spread among other people. So this is a great thing to do, is have an aesthetic lakefront as well. These are just two bigger versions of those pictures. So pickerel weed, this is one of the emergent species we talked about. It is that beautiful plant in the back left-hand corner with the purple flowers on it. You can see there is a wood duck box right above that pickerel weed. Pickerel weed is a clumping plant that when it's not maintained can look messy, but it provides beautiful flowers all summer long. Sometimes, depending on the weather, can flower year-round and provides a lot of habitat for fish and prey items, as well as habitat for our native apple snails to attach their eggs. It's also a pollinator attractor, and ducks and mammals will eat the seed heads after the flowers are gone. So pickerel weed is a great one for wildlife habitat, and as you can see, it has absolutely beautiful purple spikelets, and those leaves can get 3 to 5 feet tall, but generally they're about 3 feet out of the water, and you'd want to plant these in about 6 to 18 inches of water at a clumping density of 1 to 2 feet apart. We recommend 2 to 3 emergent plants like this per 10 square feet. So keep those limits in mind, but this is a good clumping species. It won't spread too aggressively and is absolutely beautiful. Another one we have is a series of, oh gosh, spelling errors, but duck potato, arrowhead, or other Sagittarius species have those beautiful white flowers. That's the key identifying feature, a 3-petaled white flower. The different species get different heights. Some of them stay about 3 feet, others can get 5 feet in height, but this is another clumping aquatic plant. It's usually found slightly more uphill or towards the shore than pickerel weed is, but it provides most of the same benefits. So it will have great pollinator habitat, attractors, and habitat. And the duck species, it's called duck potato for a reason. It creates little tubers in the mud, and a lot of our aquatic wading birds are very interested in eating those tubers and also the seed heads. Fragrant water lily is a favorite among people who like pretty flowers, but it's not a super great plant for people who don't like aquatic weeds. So these plants, even with the flowers, are routinely called weedy by species or by people who live along lakes or travel to lakes because they see plants in the water and they think they're a weed. These provide great shade for fish though, and can help drop the water temperature under those big leaves that they have. It's called fragrant water lily for a reason. It is a very sweet smelling flower and pollinators simply love it. The stems and the seeds are great forage sources for ducks and mammals in the area as well. This is another species I wouldn't recommend on very small ponds. This is a lot less aggressive than Sporedock, but if you have a very small pond and don't want it covered by lily pads, I would recommend not planting it. This is that one I was discussing earlier, the Sporedock. This one can get very aggressive in small systems. It perpetually looks like the flowers are about to open and be beautiful water lilies, but those flowers are actually fully open already. You can differentiate the two by looking at the leaf shape. Sporedock has that long oval shape to it and overlapping lobes at the back, whereas if I go back to the water lily real quick, it looks like you took a slice of pie out of it. So that is Sporedock. It is a native species, provides a lot of good habitat. The stems create a home for a small worm that bluegill really like to eat. So it is a great species, but if you have a small pond, I wouldn't necessarily recommend it. This is another one that people have a love-hate relationship with. This is jointed spike rush. It's very similar to club rush, which are those two Elaeocris species there. And this is the one that, in the background, you can see how Sporedock takes over, but this is the thin, dark green spikelets sticking up. And so the spike rush, similar to bulrush, sticks up out of the water like that. And it can get 2.5 to 4 feet tall depending on the exact species you get, but it provides a lot of fish habitat, and ducks and mammals will feed on the seed heads. These species are found statewide, and they are also great for erosion control. So is pickerel weed. So that is all I have for you on creating habitat near water. In summary, we want to think of wetland plants as overall habitat for wildlife in the state of Florida and elsewhere. So if you're looking to attract wading birds, you probably want to attract their prey, which is oftentimes small frogs, insects, lizards, things like that. And so this habitat provides both plant matter for birds and other wildlife to eat, but also habitat for their prey. Native wildlife are adapted to those native plants, so if we can have a healthy aquatic plant ecosystem, we can try and keep out some of those invasive exotic species. And as a shoreline resident, whether you're on a lake, a river, a creek, or own a pond on your own landscape, I just recommend having careful planning before you plant anything. That way you can avoid having a really high maintenance landscape. And with that, I will turn it over to Lara to go through any questions we might have.
Okay, great. Thank you, Shannon. So we only had 2 questions that came up, but feel free if you guys have any other questions to type them in the chat box now. So Susan was asking, she said that pickerel weed is a native plant that helps with toxic nitrogen. In Crystal River, invasive hyacinths are being planted to help with nitrogen fertilizer nutrients. Why don't they plant instead pickerel weed, which is native and works like hyacinth to detox waterways?
That is a great question, Susan, with a lot of complexities to it. So I've not heard that they've been planting hyacinth on Crystal River. Planting invasive exotic plants like water hyacinth is illegal in the state of Florida. Florida Fish and Wildlife monitors that very closely, and we have an aggressive invasive plant management system through Florida Fish and Wildlife and the Water Management District. So hyacinth cannot be planted to my knowledge, but you're absolutely right in that pickerel weed can help with excess nitrogen. And it helps through a few different ways. Any of those emergent plants provide great habitat for microorganisms that live in the root zones. And those root zones, the really thick fibrous root zones of an emergent plant like pickerel weed, bulrush, duck potato, spike rush, any of those, they create an oxygenized area in the soil. And so that oxygenated soil in the root zone provides that habitat for microorganisms, which then process the nitrogen into a form that's not available to plants or algae. And so it's really those microorganisms that do the bulk of the work with that nitrogen and phosphorus, actually, both of them. But having those aquatic plants to provide that root zone is a big part of it. Now, they do take up some when they grow because it is part of the fertilizer. It does help the actual plants grow, but as the plants die, they return that nutrient right back to the waterway. So the best way to manage for that is to pull those plants out or harvest them, which, if you were paying attention earlier in the webinar, you might need a permit to do that. So making sure that you have a good working relationship with your FWC aquatic plant biologist can really help you out, because they'll know that you know what you're doing. They'll give you a permit to allow you to remove some of those plants, and that act of growing aquatic plants and physically removing them from the system is the best thing we can do for our water, but it requires a lot of oversight. And so get to know your Florida Fish and Wildlife biologist near you.
Yeah, and I was trying to do some research while Shannon was presenting Susan on that, and I did find one article that talked about it. It was a little difficult. I didn't get to read through the whole thing, but it basically said that it was an approved study through the Kings Bay, so with Bob Knight, I guess, kind of taking the charge. So anyway, I'm going to include the link here, and Shannon and I can see, it looks like that was back in 2012, so we can see if there's been any results from that study and any other information that we can share with you. So the next question was from Lori. She asked about how deep you should dig a pond for a fish anywhere from 1 to 3 inches in size.
That is an interesting question, Lori. I would say for fish of that size, I'm not sure what species you're talking about, but fish of that size can live in very shallow water, so you might only need to dig it out a foot or two. Basically, what you'll want to do is give them enough area to have aquatic plants so that they can hide in there, and then also eat the periphyton. So periphyton is a specific type of algae that grows on top of our native plants. Eelgrass is often covered in this. People call it slime, but it's periphyton, and those little fish eat the periphyton. But those fish also eat mosquito larvae, different species of them do. So for fish of that size, those very small minnows, they do not need a lot of water, but the issue there is going to be temperature control. So if it's in the shade, you can probably get away with a more shallow body of water than if it's in full sun. If it's in full sun, you're probably going to want to dig it out a few feet more. But that's a difficult question to answer. But feel free to shoot us an email with some more specifics on that question. If you have a reason you're asking and you just need a little more specific of an answer, I'd be happy to get that for you.
Okay, and then probably the last question we can answer before we wrap up is from Kim. She asked what kind of trees work well around ponds to attract birds and provide shade.
Kim, that is a great question also. So trees, I didn't get into trees too much today, but pretty much any of our trees that are found in wetland systems. And so a lot of these can be purchased commercially or at retail centers, or with your native plant society, they might tell you where you can get some. In Florida, some great trees for that would be cypress trees. If it's a little bit drier, you might want to look at some other Florida-friendly species like river birch, or if you've got a really sandy soil that's slightly acidic, you can look at some pine species. The nice thing about trees is they do not necessarily have to be in the water to provide a lot of habitat. So just having that large shade tree up on your property a little farther, like a large pine tree, provides a lot of habitat, and that's where a lot of our wading birds will nest. Also shrubby species like Carolina willow. Carolina willow is not the most attractive species to most people, but it provides a lot of habitat to wading birds, and they like to nest in it. And then also a lot of our migratory birds like to nest in cattails and bulrush. So those aren't trees, but those tall, thick-stemmed emergent plants like bulrush and cattails provide nesting habitat for a lot of our migratory bird species as well.
Okay, so that's right on time. It's 1 o'clock, so we're going to go ahead and wrap up. And for those of you that are still on, we'd really appreciate if you would take a minute to complete a short eval. The link is right here on your screen. Oops, It's a little weird with the PowerPoint. Anyway, you see the link on your screen, hopefully. And there's also a link provided there if you would like to register for any of our future webinars. And like Shannon said, if you have questions after this, you can contact us via email separately, and we can answer any specific questions you have. So thanks, Shannon, for a great presentation, and thank you all for tuning in, and hope to see you in August.
Yes, thank you all so much. And just one final reminder, in the bottom left-hand corner of your screen, there is a long list of resources for anyone interested in more information. The Plants for Lakefront Revegetation, that is a publication that was done by Florida Department of Environmental Protection and Florida Fish and Wildlife in cooperation with a few different organizations, but it gives you planting densities and all sorts of great information, so I do highly recommend that one. But thank you all so much.